Well, hello everybody. Dr. Heldman here, Ancient Texts Revealed. How are you doing today? So, for a long time I've been fascinated with the character Nimrod. He is found in Genesis 10 and 11, 14. And I wanted to dig into who he is, what he was about. And one of the things that I was particularly interested in is Nimrod a Nephilim? Did he come from the Nephilim? And I don't know for sure, even after doing all the studying I'm doing. I have some philosophies about it, but I wanted to share with you what I did find as I was studying about Nimrod. So let's get started. This should be super interesting. Well, one thing I know in having researched Nimrod so much, I went through Jewish literature, the pseudepigrapha, the Apocrypha, all the other sources that I could find to learn more about him. It turned out some very, very interesting information. Near as I can tell, he was definitely a human being. He was definitely very strong and very powerful. He was super wicked. He was devoted to being wicked. And so I'm not sure if he was a Nephilim or not. Here's the thing I'm wondering. I'll give it to you ahead of time so you can mull on this and do your own research, whatever you'd like to do. But he may have come across some of the experiments that the Watchers and the Nephilim were doing in terms of DNA aggregation and, messing around with DNA projects. And he may have figured out a way to become a Nephilim himself. That has been my backdrop for what I've been thinking, and I don't go into this just assuming this. I'm going to present you the literature that we know about him out there, but this is a theory of mine that at some point, because he was in that area where all of this went down, there in the area of Shinar, it could be that he found some evidence of ways to do things, ways to increase one's strength and one's power. Certainly today, we have a lot of men running around that want to do that, so it doesn't seem unreasonable that he might want to figure that out. But let's dive in and let's see what we can find out about him. So first of all, he was from the lineage of Noah, which you would think would be a good thing because Noah was a righteous man when he got off the boat, and he had a son named Ham, and Ham had a son named Cush, and Nimrod came from the lineage of Cush. So Nimrod is directly related to Noah, so that's a good thing. I think that's fine. Now let's take a look at some of the exegesis here of Nimrod. This is from Genesis 10, 8 through 9. This is where it begins. Cush was the father of Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one upon the earth. This is where you start thinking about, okay, is he mighty because he's a Nephilim? That's what got me thinking about this. So I wanted to do some exegesis on the word and figure out what was going on here. It also says that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, which is absolutely true. If you read all of the literature about him that you can find, you will find out that he did go out and kill vast quantities of different kinds of animals, and he was known to be a mighty hunter. And it says before Yahweh, which implies to me, either Yahweh was always watching Nimrod and just to see what he was doing, or it could be that he was actually dedicated to Yahweh, but the documents don't dictate that. Nimrod was definitely not a nice guy. Now in Hebrew, I've shown the Hebrew there for you, and I've also supplied the phonetic pronunciation there for you. Vachush yilad et Nimrod hu hachel Lehiyot Gibor Ba'aritz. So this is the earth, Ba'aritz right here. Gibor means mighty one. So let's take this apart a little bit. First of all, it's called Nimrod. It's not Nimrod, it's Nimrod. And we mispronounce it as Nimrod, but it is Nimrod if you wanted to really pronounce it correctly. His name means rebel. Or it could be taken from the Hebrew word marad, which means to rebel, or it could mean the valiant. And in this case, it was sort of all three of these things, because he was rebellious against God, but he was also a valiant leader and a valiant hunter. Now the word Gabor right here, you should say that with a long E, like Gibor. In this case is Gibor. What that means is large, mighty one, or hero. Now we want to come back to that word because we're going to find that in Genesis 6 as well when they're talking about the Nephilim. So when you see a word like this, you see Gabor, and you're like, oh, well, that might mean that he is a Nephilim. That's what got me started down this path. And then the word he began is really interesting to me here. It says here, where was it? He began to be a mighty one on the earth. Now that really triggered me because I'm like, well, if he began to be a mighty one, does that mean that he was learning how to be? Does that mean that he stumbled upon something and now he became a mighty one and he began? I'm not sure about that. Now the term is hechel, and it means he began. It literally means he began. So the translation out of the Masoretic text would be, and Cush begat Nimrod, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. So that's the baseline scripture for us regarding Nimrod. Now let's talk about the Nephilim. I want to take a look at the Nephilim and see if I can compare and contrast these two, stare and compare between the two. So I've got a few slides I want to go through regarding this. Let's talk about this word Gibor because it appears in Genesis 6:4 as well. The Giborim, the mighty ones. And I've highlighted it in yellow so you can see where it shows up in the Hebrew, in the text, in the Hebrew, and in the phonetic pronunciation, so that you can see that there is where these words line up at. And so let's take a look. So the Nephilim are here, were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. This is a long, sordid, big, huge, complex story. There's a lot to know about that. It is a fascinating story. Probably, I'm going to tell you, I think this is the most important story that never gets told to the children of God. This is something that is so vastly important, and yet it's not told to anyone. And then it says, these were the mighty men. And then in the gray, I've pointed out where that comes from, and there's that Giborim, ha-Giborim. And of course the im on here, that yod and that mem means that that is plural. It was multiple men. Multiple mighty men. They were Giborim. And then Nephilim is often translated as the fallen ones or giants. Now, here's the thing. We have Nephilim, that's the Hebrew spelling of it. Here's Nephilim, Nephilim in Hebrew in Genesis 6:4, and the phonetic ha-Nephilim, meaning plural. There were lots of them. It can be translated as fallen ones, and the root word is nephal, or giants, and this is where they're getting it to fall, from nephal to fall, or giants. So the use of Gibor does link Nimrod to the Nephilim descriptively as a mighty one. It says, but the Hebrew text does not explicitly call him a Nephilim or indicate divine human hybrid ancestry. Now I want to take issue with that because the Bible doesn't call Goliath a Nephilim. It doesn't call Og of Bashan a Nephilim. There are other characters that show up in the Bible whose names we know, but we also know that they were Nephilim. So I'm not altogether convinced of this, that he was not a Nephilim yet. Now let's talk a little bit more about this. So we want to check with the Septuagint. Now why is the Septuagint important to us? Well, when we have the Hebrew text, that's awesome. I love Hebrew. I'm a big fan of it. It's very difficult to learn. I'm still learning it. I'll probably spend the rest of my life learning it. And if I'm being honest with you, I think it is the language of heaven. So I think when we get to heaven, we're going to wind up speaking Hebrew. But during Jesus' time, they spoke Greek. And so what happened was scholars went and looked at the Hebrew in the Old Testament. They had the New Testament, was, the Greek. And then they rendered the Old Testament in Greek, and this is called the Septuagint. And it's worth your while when you're doing studying like this to validate against the Septuagint just to see if it's saying something a little bit different than what the Hebrew might be saying. The whole idea here isn't to try and poke holes in the scripture. The idea is to try to make as much common sense out of what the Scripture is saying as you possibly can. So here's the text. This is the Greek text here. Here's the phonetic here. And there's three things I want to point out here. Nimrod here is Nimrod. Nimrod is the name for Nimrod in Greek. And then this word gigas here, this means giant, gigas. He was a giant. And then erkato, this is hard to say. This little thing here is pronounced like aksli. It's a weird letter to try to say if you're not from Greece. But it's erkato, and it means he began. This seems to indicate to me that at some juncture, Nimrod might have thought about becoming a Nephilim. Well, why would that appeal to him? Well, because these guys were 18, 19 feet tall. They weighed hundreds of pounds. Their arms were longer than your body. He wanted that strength. My guess, and I don't know this for a fact, but I'm just guessing that they inherited the intelligence of their watcher fathers. They were somebody that you might look up to, especially, if they were still roaming about the earth. They were violent, they were cannibals, they were mean, they did not love the Lord. And I've got this theory here that Nimrod discovered how to become one of these guys and became one. I can't satisfy that theory, but that is my working theory. And so the translation is, and Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a giant on the earth. Well, now that satisfies me more than what the Hebrew text says. So now I'm thinking, well, maybe I am on the right track. I just don't know. Let's take a little bit more look at this. So let's look at the Greek in Genesis 6:4. This is the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. And the word is gigantes. Gigantes. I'm tempted to say he, and I shouldn't. This is a G. And you should say gigantes. Gigantes for the Nephilim. There's the scripture there. There's the phonetic for it. And the main thing that we're concentrating on here is the word gigantes, which means giants. And here it's Nephilim. So the two are compared together, meaning that there's a good smooth flow into the two of these things. So the authors of the Septuagint understood what a giant was in Hebrew, and they rendered it correctly as gigantes, plural. Now the Septuagint's use of gigas for Nimrod directly parallels its term for the Nephilim. This suggests a stronger association than the Hebrew would suggest, which is just Gibor, mighty man. However, it does not explicitly state that he is a Nephilim or descended from them, only that he was giant in stature or renown. And it does say that he became a mighty man. And he was a mighty hunter as well, so we can't neglect the idea that he had a reputation for being a very, very good hunter. Let's think about the pseudepigrapha here for a minute. So I went in and I did some research into the Jewish books. I love Sepharia. I can't pronounce it right. I'll put the link on the movie here. Sepharia comes from the Hebrew word for book, which is sefer. Love those guys. They do a great job of making all of this literature available to you. And I looked in the Midrash. A Midrash is an interpretive commentary. And so it says, some traditions amplify Nimrod's stature, but stop short of calling him a Nephilim. Nimrod was a mighty hunter of men, ensnaring them with his words. This is found in Pirkei di Rabbi Eleazar, the chapters of Rabbi Eleazar. That's what Pirkei means. Chapter 24. And you could go out to Sepharia.org and look it up yourself. It is definitely there. And no mention is made of divine ancestry. And then, of course, Rabbi Hachanai, I guess is how you would say that. Nimrod was a mighty hero, as it is said, and Cush begat Nimrod, who began to be a mighty one on the earth. Rabbi Yehuda said, the coats which the Holy One, blessed be he, made for Adam and his wife were with Noah and the ark. And when they went forward from the ark, Ham, the son of Noah, brought them forth with him. So now get the picture here. These coats that Adam and Eve wore way back in the day went clear through the flood with Noah. And so they've got these coats from Adam and Eve, and they were given to Ham. and he gave them as an inheritance to Nimrod. And when Nimrod put on these coats, all the beasts, the animals, the birds, when they saw the coats, came and prostrated themselves before him. The sons of men thought that this was due to the power of his might. Therefore they made him king over themselves, as it is said, wherefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. This is a fascinating story, and it's interpretive, so we don't know if this is really true or not. But, you know, it kind of makes sense in a little way, because if the coats of Adam and Eve, the clothing of Adam and Eve, were on the ark, they were given to Ham, they still must have had, because God was the one that made those, they must have had that power imbued in them. He gives it to Nimrod. Nimrod puts it on, and all of the animals from all over the earth come around and prostrate themselves before him, meaning, and that in this person's case, that's why they said that he was a mighty hunter. I think that's a fascinating story. Now here's some more in the book of Jasher. When the animals saw Nimrod wearing those coats, they knelt before him. He became the first man to rule the whole world. This comes out of Sefer HaYashar, Noah 9a. This suggests supernatural power via Adam's garments, but not Nephilim status necessarily. And the two couldn't blend. If I had supernatural power because I'm wearing the garments that God created for Adam and Eve, I don't think a Nephilim could even get close to those or put them on, because there was so much difference between God and these Nephilim who he ultimately destroyed. Also in the Zohar, which is sort of a supernatural way of looking at things, it says, so it is written of Nimrod, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, this being the starting point from which he commenced to attach himself to other powers. Now that's very intriguing to me. I don't follow the Zohar. I'm not into that. The Jews can go get into gematria, where they start looking at the numbers, which I think is fascinating. Then the Zohar is more supernatural in its aspects. But I want to tell you, this is very interesting to me, because he's saying it commenced himself to attach himself to other powers. This leads me to wonder, was Nimrod walking down the path one day, and he finds this whatever stone that has a recipe on it, and he starts following it, and then presto, the next thing you know, he winds up as a Nephilim. I just don't know. I think it's a very, very intriguing story. Similarly, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, a place in which they conceived the idea for forsaking the supernal power for one another. Now, this is an important point here. As you read, especially when you read the Jewish literature, ancient church fathers, they're going to say Nimrod made up his mind to not follow the Lord. Even though he was a descendant of Noah, he decided not to follow the Lord. This was a deliberate decision, as were the people that he ruled over. So this is a very, very intriguing time on the face of the planet. Let's look at some more. There's a pseudepigrapha called Eruvin. They disagreed about this verse as well, and it came to pass in the days of Amraphel. Now I put this in here. I'm going to go down the Genesis 14 road with another movie, because it's a fascinating story. But a lot of people think that Amraphel is the same person as Nimrod, and that he was renamed. And they go into it in this case here. Rav and Shmuel both identified Amraphel with Nimrod. However, one said Nimrod was his name, and why was his name called Amraphel? It turns out the reason for this is because it's a contraction of two Hebrew words, as he says, Amar, the command, and cast, Hipil, our father Abram into the fiery furnace. Now, we've already had that story, so we know that that really did happen, or we've read it in the book of Jasher anyway. Abraham rebelled against and challenged his proclaimed divinity. So Abraham did not like the fact that Nimrod thought he was God. And one said Amraphel was his name, and why was his name called Nimrod? Because he caused the entire world to rebel, Nimrod, against God during his reign. So I think it's evident to me that when we talk about Nimrod, we could just as easily substitute his name Amraphel. Now, there's some apocryphal texts and some comparative texts that we can go look at as well. So there's the Book of Giants. This was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is part of the Pseudepigrapha. It's well known, and you probably should get a copy of it. It's very, very interesting reading. This is from the Louvre, this picture here. I've seen this in person, where he's carrying a lion. Now, get a feel for this. So if this is Gilgamesh here, but if this is Gilgamesh, and this is a lion, and if you think about how big lions are, he's got this lion in the crux of his arm. That lion's not going anywhere. This is a big dude here. I do not know if you've read the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it's worth your reading, because a lot of scholars believe that Gilgamesh was a type and shadow, or a portent, or actually was a Nephilim. So the Book of Giants mentions Nephilim and their offspring. Specifically, two names of the offspring are mentioned, Oya and Haya, but Nimrod is absent from these fragments. That doesn't mean he's not there, because the Book of Giants in the Dead Sea Scrolls is heavily fragmented, so we don't have the entire book. We don't know everything there is to know about it. And then the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I think is worth a read. It's a pretty good story. It's one of the oldest stories on the planet. Gilgamesh is a possible parallel to Nimrod. He's described as 2/3 divine. Now think about this. So I want to be like God. I've decided that I'm going to rebel against God. I'm going to basically flip God the bird, and I'm going to start being my own God. And now I discover this way that the Watchers and the Nephilim had gone about doing their genetic manipulations and their bestiality, and they wound up with these demigods and these weird oddball offshoots of what God had never intended to be. And he said, well, I could do that, and I would be the first guinea pig to try that. I think it's possible. Anyway, Gilgamesh was considered to be 2/3 divine, but this stems from specific Mesopotamian mythology. His mother Ninsun is a goddess, not the Genesis Nephilim narrative. And I think this is hogwash. This is some scholar who's trying to poo-poo scriptural text, but that's okay. I'll give him that. I just wanted to bring that to you, that shows up in the contextualization of what we're talking about with regard to Nimrod. Now let's look at some scholarly perspectives. So there's a historical view. This guy E.A. Spicer connects him with the Tukulti Ninurta in 13th century BCE. He was a historical Mesopotamian ruler, not a Nephilim, and this came from encyclopedia.com. There's also the linguistic view, the Hebrew Gibor, and the LXX, that's the symbol for the Septuagint. Gigas suggests renown or strength, not necessarily Nephilim ancestry. Now, focus in on that not necessarily. We cannot rule that out because of that term Gigas, or that's very, very important. So that's something we might want to think about as we go along here. And then there is the theological view. Nimrod's might is human, not divine hybrid, contrasting with Genesis 6's Nephilim. This comes from the Armstrong Institute, with whom, you know, I mean, when you have a conventional Bible scholar like this, they have a certain predilection for their views and their bases, and that's what they're writing here. So I take away maybe, maybe not. I'm still not sure. Well, what's our conclusion? So here's our conclusion. The Hebrew text, Nimrod is Gibor, the mighty one, like the Nephilim, but it lacks explicit Nephilim designation or divine ancestry. In the Septuagint, this is very compelling. The word gigas, which means giant, aligns him with Nephilim terminology, but contextually he is Cush's son, not a sons of God offspring. And I will grant you that he is the son of Cush, but that does not mean that he could not have genetically altered himself to become like the Nephilim. I think that's still a possibility here. We just don't know. I'm not sure that we'll ever know. Jewish traditions emphasize his power and rebellion, i.e. the Tower of Babel. That's the next thing we're going to talk about, not Nephilim status. And then there are comparative texts. Mesopotamian figures like Gilgamesh offer parallels but Nimrod's biblical portrayal remains human. Now, with regard to Gilgamesh, I'll say one last thing about that. When you're reading Gilgamesh, there's a big long period where Gilgamesh goes and looks for this king. And he finds the king ultimately. He had to go through all this water to get to him. And he finds the king ultimately. And a lot of biblical scholars think that king was Noah. So they're linking the Mesopotamian figures here, the story that this is a Mesopotamian story of Gilgamesh, to the story of Noah. So I don't think you should throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of aligning Gilgamesh with Nephilim, perhaps even with Nimrod. So that's all I've got. I just wanted to make you whet your appetite a little bit, maybe get you thinking, was Nimrod perhaps a Nephilim? When they were going to build the Tower of Babel, which we'll talk about in the next video, that was an architectural feat. It was silly and it was dumb and stupid, but it was an architectural feat, and it's a very, very interesting story, and they would have to have had help from the Watchers, or some sort of writing about the Watchers, or even tutorial. I don't know. But this wasn't something that man himself could just sit there and build. There had to have been some supernatural help in the form of building this ziggurat that was attempting to go clear to the heavens. Anyway, food for thought. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Comment on this video. Get your friends to watch this video. I really love this period. I find that I'm really enjoying being in this period of time in scriptures and doing the research and studying all this. And I hope you find it fascinating as well. And I will talk to you in the next video, and may God bless you richly.